The stars above Greenwood Springs, Montana were hidden that night. Heavy clouds pressed low against the pine ridges, their weight broken only by a steady, relentless rain. Not a downpour, not the sharp rattle of summer storms. No, this rain whispered cold truths through the eaves of old houses and across empty streets. It soaked deeper than skin. Down Main Street, puddles gathered in shallow depressions worn by decades of logging trucks and faded station wagons. The storefronts stood dark. A single, flickering, neon open sign buzzed in the window of Bucky's Diner, but even the regulars had gone home early. Greenwood Springs wasn't on tourist maps. It was a narrow wedge of a town between timberland and an old half-abandoned freight line. The kind of place where a man could live 50 years and still be called new. Stories didn't travel fast here. They lingered unspoken in the cracks of weathered sidewalks. And no one in town expected much that night. The weather had promised wet roads and little else, certainly no visitors. And certainly not Walter Grayson. His vehicle was easy to miss in daylight, but impossible not to notice under those flickering lamps. A battered 1968 Chevrolet Suburban, faded navy rust curling along the wheel well's headlights faint as fireflies in the mist. It rumbled softly through the rain, a sound more felt than heard. Walter sat straight behind the wheel. 73 years old, widower, retired military if whispers were to be believed. Folks in Greenwood Springs called him the old man from Pine Hollow, but no one really knew him. He spoke little, visited town less, and when he did, he came alone. Tonight was different. His hands veined, steady gripped the worn leather wheel with an ease born of habit. In the passenger seat, secured with a thick leather strap, rested a small iron strongbox, its surface pitted and dark with age. Walter glanced at it, once eyes flickering with something between duty and memory. Ahead, at the edge of town where the bridge crossed, Yellowtail Creek lights broke through the mist, red, blue, pale white. A law enforcement checkpoint, unexpected. 2 county cruisers, 3 deputies under rain-slicked hoods, flashlights cutting cold beams through the fog. Walter slowed. The Suburban hissed on the wet asphalt tires, gripping uncertainly. A young deputy, no older than 25, raised a gloved hand. His breath showed in the air as he leaned toward the rolled-down window. "Evening, sir. License and registration, please." His voice was polite, practiced. Routine. Walter nodded once. Without haste, he reached inside his worn jacket and produced both documents. The deputy took them, brow furrowing slightly as he read the name. Mr. Grayson. Heading somewhere this late, Walter's voice was low, sanded rough by years and silence. Out of town. Errand. Bit late for errands. Walter didn't answer. His gaze drifted momentarily to the iron box. The young deputy followed his glance, curiosity flickering. "What's in the box, sir?" Walter met his eyes. "Not yours to know." The deputy stiffened, uncertainty blooming. He gestured subtly to his partner, an older deputy with broad shoulders and a lined face. The second man approached frowning. "Everything all right here, just odd," the younger deputy replied. "Won't say what's in the case." The older man leaned in. His tone was firm. "Sir, please step out of the vehicle." Walter obeyed without question. The rain slicked across his shoulders as he emerged. The iron box remained fastened to the passenger seat. "Any weapons on you?" "No." "Anything illegal?" "No," but the weight in his voice gave the deputies pause. After a silent glance exchanged between them, the cuffs came out. No roughness, no shouted commands, just procedure cold as the rain. The strongbox was unfastened, carefully tagged, and placed in the rear of a cruiser. Walter's eyes never left it. At the Greenwood County Sheriff's Office, the motions continued. Fingerprints, mugshot, a dog tag-shaped indentation glimpsed beneath his collar, drew a second look. "Military?" the booking deputy asked silently. "Something like that," the arresting deputy muttered. Then the oddity came. When Walter's ID was entered into the system, the screen flashed crimson and override. Not a warrant, not a flag. A simple line of text, secure individual and object. Do not question, await federal response. A chill moved through the room. The night sergeant read the screen twice, jaw tightening. "Put him in holding, and don't touch that box again." Walter was led to a dim cell concrete floor, cold beneath his boots. He sat calmly, hands folded, eyes distant. The surveillance camera blinked overhead. He did not look at it. Outside in the rainy, dark Greenwood Springs slept, unaware, and Walter Grayson waited, because he knew what would come next, and it would not be small. As the clock inside the holding cell ticked onward, a shadow began to stir in Washington. The holding cell in Greenwood County Sheriff's Office was built for petty drunks and an occasional brawler from the paper mill, not for a man like Walter Grayson. It had been 1 hour and 15 minutes since the strange red message had appeared on the booking screen. The words still glowed faintly frozen. Secure individual and object. Do not question. Await federal response. The station had grown silent, not the routine stillness of late shifts, but a thicker kind, an airless pause where conversation drained away and instinct warned, something larger is at play. Stay out of its way. Deputy Marshal Ed Crowley, 30 years in law enforcement, stood at the central console, arms folded. He'd seen federal warrants, state alerts, even a few military SEALs pop through their outdated system. But he'd never seen an override, and certainly not one that no one in Helena or D.C. seemed to recognize. Run his background again, he said, voice low. Deputy Jenna Ray Young, sharp-eyed, tapped at the terminal. Her brows knitted. Sir, same thing. Basic Wyoming license matches the vehicle. But once I pulled deeper, she tapped another key, frowning files vanish. Public records just stop. Tax history ends in 1988. No phone contract, no insurance. Crowley leaned closer. Military records fragment only, Jenna whispered. Something called Project Ember Ridge Clearance Red. But it looks like someone tried to scrub it. The file barely exists. Crowley exhaled through his nose. He'd commanded riot squads, led high-profile arrests, but nothing put cold in his veins like a red clearance. You didn't poke around those files. You waited for the call. He straightened. Lock the evidence room. Box goes in locker 9. No one touches it. Jenna nodded and hurried down the hall. The iron strongbox sat on a steel shelf, now tagged but untouched. The room seemed colder around it. Across the station, younger deputies whispered. Some half-joked about nuclear secrets. Others stared uneasily at the monitors. Outside, the rain still fell soft, now soaking the earth deeper, a thin mist crawling through the deserted streets of Greenwood Springs. In holding cell 1, Walter Grayson sat exactly where they'd left him, straight-backed on the bench, hands resting lightly on his knees. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't blinked toward the surveillance camera. Until now. As Deputy Ray checked the hallway feed, she froze. Sir, she called softly to Crowley. He approached. On the monitor, Grayson had turned his head. His pale blue eyes were locked directly on the camera, unblinking aware. He knows we're watching, Jenna murmured. Crowley studied the screen. He didn't like the sensation creeping down his spine. Outside headlights flickered briefly through the rain. The front desk buzzed. Dispatcher Carl Henson answered, brow furrowed. Yes, a clipped voice on the line. Convoy inbound. ETA, 8 minutes. Do not question further. Do not transfer custody. Henson's voice caught. Who the line went dead. Crowley rubbed his jaw. His instincts screamed for caution. We hold him. We do nothing else. 7 minutes later, 6 black Suburbans glided into the lot. No sirens, no lights. Engines purred low. Deputies gathered near the window. None spoke. From the lead vehicle, a woman stepped out, mid-40s, short-cropped, dark hair, black coat, slim earpiece visible against her skin. She moved with the certainty of someone used to commanding rooms where no one questioned orders. The station doors opened. She entered without introduction. I'm Agent Delia Rowan, Department of Federal Oversight. I'm here for the man in holding one, and the case he brought. Crowley met her gaze. He's secure. We haven't questioned him. Rowan gave a brief nod. Good. You've done your job. Now step aside. Deputies lined the hall as Rowan and 2 agents moved toward holding. Crowley followed silently, heart pounding. Inside the cell, Walter was already standing, as if he'd heard her approach through the concrete. Their eyes met. Mr. Grayson, Rowan said quietly. Walter inclined his head. Agent Rowan. No surprise. No fear. Just weary recognition. Rowan turned to Crowley. Have locker 9 prepared. I will open the box myself. No one else. Crowley hesitated. Agent, what is this about? She glanced back, her voice calm but iron-edged. This is about something that was never supposed to resurface, and you're lucky it's not your burden to carry. As the deputies stepped back, the air in the station seemed to thicken, the kind of thickness that signaled the end of old stories and the start of darker ones. And Walter Grayson waited knowing the next moments would finally unseal the past he'd guarded for 40 years. Outside, beneath a steady whisper of rain, Greenwood Springs slept on, unaware that history was about to turn inside their own station walls. The steel click of the holding cell door echoed down the tiled corridor, like a clock striking midnight. Agent Delia Rowan entered alone. No badge raised this time, no preamble. The weight of her presence was enough. Across the room, Walter Grayson was already standing tall despite the years shoulders squared beneath a soaked flannel coat. His eyes met hers with the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly why she had come. "Mr. Grayson," Rowan said softly. Walter nodded. Agent Rowan. There was history in those names. History no one else in the station would ever read about. In the hallway, Deputy Marshal Ed Crowley watched grimly as two other federal agents moved toward the evidence room. No one else followed. The station, normally humming with the low pulse of small-town law enforcement, was now gripped by something deeper reverence edged with fear. Crowley handed over the key to locker 9. "We haven't opened it," Good Rowan replied. "You'll understand why." Inside the evidence room, the lights flickered once, a faint hum that no one missed. Rowan approached the battered iron strongbox like a priest might approach a forgotten altar. She pulled on thin black gloves, turning the old key slowly. The lid creaked upward, hinges groaning under years of wear. What lay inside was not what the deputies had imagined during their whispered speculations. No weapons, no drugs, no flash of gold or encrypted cash, just papers yellowed brittle, their edges curled with time, photographs, black and white, faces blurred or marked through with red ink, a small flash drive sealed in a clear evidence pouch, and beneath all of it a thin black metal rectangle worn smooth, no bigger than a modern phone, serial number etched faintly across one edge, K3117 on HEM9. Agent Rowan inhaled sharply. For the first time that night, a flicker of unease crossed her face. She whispered, barely audible, "It's real." Crowley, standing just behind her, frowned. "What is it?" Rowan didn't answer immediately. Instead, she produced a handheld scanner, passing it slowly over the black device. A soft beep. The scanner flashed, green confirmed. Rowan turned to Crowley. "I need your conference room." "Private." Crowley hesitated. "You'll need to explain something to my team. You'll get your briefing." "After." She looked toward the holding cell. "Bring Mr. Grayson. Only him." Minutes later, the small wood-paneled conference room at the back of the station was secured. Walter Grayson sat at the head of the table, posture unbroken, eyes steady. Rowan placed the case before him. Crowley stood at the wall, flanked by deputies Ray and Torres, silent observers, to something far beyond their clearance. Rowan took a long breath. "Gentlemen," she began, voice calm but deliberate, "what you're about to hear is classified beyond federal level. Formal debrief and NDAs will follow. But since you've already seen the case, I'll give you the short version." She turned to Walter. "Would you like to explain?" Walter nodded once. His voice emerged low, resonant, each word deliberate. "In 1976, I was recruited into a cross-agency operation called Project Ember Ridge. Not soldiers, not spies, handlers. We were trusted with intelligence too volatile for digital systems." He lifted one of the old photographs, 4 men in a dense jungle clearing, faded fatigue's faces blurred. One face was circled in red ink. "This was my team. Operation Iron Mantle. We carried the data. We protected it from enemies abroad, and worse, from those inside." He placed the photo down. "This," he continued, fingers resting on the black device's the key, "embedded encryption tied to those original files. Combined with that flash drive," he nodded toward the pouch, "it unlocks evidence of illegal weapons transfers, covert operations never sanctioned, and names of individuals who've remained in power through silence and fear." The room stayed frozen. Crowley swallowed. "You're telling us you've been carrying this for decades?" Walter's expression didn't change. 41 years. Hidden. As promised." Rowan added. "Until recently, this device was believed destroyed, but a dormant protocol reactivated last month. The network traced the last custodian. Mr. Grayson was still listed. Walter looked to her now, voice softer. I was told to wait until the world was ready, until that signal came. It did, didn't it? Rowan nodded. Yes. A long silence followed. The deputies barely breathed. Crowley spoke last, voice rough, with something close to admiration. You held the line. Walter gave a faint, almost weary smile. That was the job. Outside the room, the station remained hushed. Young deputies stared at the hallway cameras, not understanding what they were glimpsing, only that history had moved through their town. As Rowan prepared to close the case, she glanced at Walter one final time. Do you want an escort home? Walter shook his head. I came alone. I'll leave alone. The rain had stopped when he stepped outside. A thin mist rose off the wet streets. Greenwood Springs slept on. But inside the hearts of those few who now knew the truth, something vast and heavy had just shifted. And in Washington, far from this small Montana town, the first ripples of that shift were already reaching the highest levels of government. They couldn't stop it. By the time dawn pushed thin light through the mist-cloaked ridges of Greenwood Springs, the iron strongbox was gone. So were the black Suburbans. And Walter Grayson had walked out of the Greenwood County Sheriff's Office at first light, refusing a ride, declining conversation. A nod to Deputy Marshal Crowley at the door. A quiet glance toward Deputy Torres, whose hands had cuffed him hours before. Then he disappeared down the sidewalk, swallowed by the gray hush of the Montana morning. Mission complete. But silence did not mean peace. 2 hours later, as the morning shift changed at the station, a man in a dark suit arrived alone. No name offered, no badge shown, just a thin metal case and an envelope marked Internal Containment Protocol, Witness Debrief. He handed it to Crowley without a word and departed. Inside the envelope were orders, not requests. Every officer who had seen the contents of the case, Crowley, Torres Ray, and dispatcher Carl Henson, was scheduled for immediate individual debriefs. They were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, binding them from ever speaking of what had transpired. And by then, no one had the will to resist. Torres sat across from the federal agent in the small break room. A single black pen, one piece of paper. This is your NDA, the agent said. Read carefully before signing. Torres hesitated. His voice broke the tense quiet. Is it true, he asked softly. The agent met his eyes. What part that old man? He protected it all this time alone. The agent's reply was cool, almost distant. He did what most could not. He held the line. Later, after the agent left, the station remained in a strange fog. Radios played too low. Voices stayed hushed. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of that night. Crowley stood near the back window, staring toward the ridges. He had survived riots, floods, even a plane crash. But something deeper had just passed through Greenwood Springs, and every instinct told him the story was not over. Across town, word began to seep through the cracks. The Hollow Times, the local weekly paper, got a tip an early janitor at the station had seen the federal convoy. He didn't talk to reporters, but at Millie's diner over steaming coffee, he asked a simple question. You hear anything strange last night? 'Cause that old guy, he left with more protection than the governor. Rumors spread fast in a town where not much else did, but details did not leak. No one could say what the old man had carried, only that it had brought in a level of federal response no one had ever witnessed here. Back at his cabin at the end of Pine Hollow Road, Walter Grayson returned to a life most thought he had abandoned long ago. No mailbox, no cell service, just wind and trees. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and, for the first time in 41 years, no longer needed to glance at the road every 15 minutes. He brewed coffee on the old stove set on the porch and waited for the silence to feel real again. But peace never comes without shadows. That evening, across the country in a glass tower in Washington, D.C., a secure alert pinged across an encrypted network. Project Ember Ridge artifact recovered. Custodian disengaged. A high-ranking official frowned, fingers steepled. Asset is back in play, he said into the phone. The voice on the other end paused. Exposure level minimal. But this isn't about exposure. It's about what else he may have written, what else he may have left behind. Understood. Send a team. quietly, monitor only. That night in Greenwood Springs, an unmarked black SUV parked a quarter-mile from Walter's cabin. No headlights, no approach, just the waiting. Walter sat on his porch, coffee cooling in his hand. He knew they were there. He didn't move. By morning, the SUV was gone. But Walter hadn't slept. He didn't need to. He had planned for this too. 3 days later, a package arrived at the Hollow Times. No return address. Inside, a letter typed on an old machine. He wasn't just a man with a case. He was the last link in a chain of silence the government tried to erase. And now that the chain is broken, someone will try to forge it again. Ask yourself who benefits from secrets. Attached, a faded photograph, 4 men in a jungle clearing. One circled in red. The editor read it twice, then locked it in her desk. The story was never printed, but the photograph remained. Back at the sheriff's station, Torres opened his locker to find a small envelope. Inside, a simple handwritten note. You cuffed me, but you followed orders. That means you'll probably make it. Torres folded it carefully, placed it behind his badge. Told no one. The ripple of that night did not crash like a wave. It moved like fog, slow creeping, always out of sight. And far beyond the ridges of Greenwood Springs, in rooms where power was measured in shadows, the name Walter Grayson was being whispered again for the first time in decades. But back in Pine Hollow, the old man waited, because some things had not yet ended. Not quite. The seasons turned in Greenwood Springs. From the cold mist of that October night to the first snowfall in late November, life in the small Montana town settled back into its quiet rhythm. The sheriff's station returned to routine domestic disputes, stray elk calls, icy road accidents. But those who had been there, Crowley, Torres Ray, and Henson, knew better. A memory like that doesn't fade. They didn't speak of it, not openly, but their eyes would meet sometimes when the scanner beeped or a black SUV passed through town. A shared understanding lived between them now, and Walter Grayson returned to his pattern of solitude. Once a week, he drove the battered 1968 Suburban into town, same route along Yellowtail Creek, same parking spot by Howard's Market. He still bought the same things. 1 loaf of bread, coffee grounds, canned peaches. People noticed him more now. They waved a little slower, a little more respectful. Some with curiosity, others with quiet recognition. He would nod politely, say little, move on. Deputy Torres, now wearing the silver sergeant's bar on his collar, watched him one crisp morning from the courthouse steps. He looks lighter, Deputy Ray remarked. Torres nodded. He finished what he had to. One cold January evening, after the sun had dipped below the snowy ridges, a black government sedan, not an SUV this time, turned slowly onto Pine Hollow Road. Walter was already standing on his porch jacket, zipped high, watching. A woman stepped out, mid-50s, dignified in civilian clothes. In her hand, she cradled a small wooden box held like something sacred. Walter opened the door before she could knock. He said nothing. The woman extended the box with both hands, gaze steady. Inside, a folded American flag, a letter signed by a federal director, and an old faded photograph, him and his old team, the one who hadn't made it home. The man Walter had promised, I'll carry it, until it's safe. The letter read simply, the truth was received. His name is preserved. So is yours. Walter nodded once. No words exchanged. He placed the wooden box on the mantel above his fireplace. He never pointed it out to visitors, never explained it. But sometimes in the flickering light, his eyes would drift upward, and he'd sit a little straighter. In the spring, Marshal Crowley retired. On his last day in uniform, he stopped by Walter's cabin, out of sight of his deputies. He wore no badge, no gun, just plain clothes and the gravity of a man closing one chapter of his life. He offered his hand. Glad it was you, Crowley said. Walter clasped it firmly. So am I. Sergeant Torres remained in the department. The folded note Walter had left him that strange morning. You cuffed me, but you followed orders, stayed in his badge wallet for years. When young deputies asked what made a good cop, he didn't say bravery. He said clarity. Life in Greenwood Springs moved on. The Hollow Times never published the story, but the editor kept that faded jungle photograph locked in her desk. She looked at it sometimes when the wind howled through the pines or when certain black vehicles passed through town. Far away, deep beneath secured government vaults in Washington, the black device K317RHEM9 was cataloged and locked beneath 20 levels of clearance. But those who needed to know, they knew. And in quiet places across the country and beyond, whispers began about the man who waited and delivered. A man who had carried a burden quietly without recognition, without demand, only resolve. One crisp autumn morning, 5 years later, a young cadet at the Greenwood Law Enforcement Academy raised her hand during ethics training. "Who was Walter Grayson?" she asked. The instructor paused, smiled faintly. "He was a man who didn't ask for recognition. He asked for time. And when that time came, he answered." Outside, the wind stirred the pines. And on the porch of a weathered cabin at the end of Pine Hollow Road, an old man in a faded flannel jacket sat watching the horizon. A hawk cried high above, and for the first time in decades, he didn't feel the weight. The world moved on. The names had been preserved, the chain broken and rebuilt. And deep in the heart of Greenwood Springs, a quiet legacy endured, not in headlines or medals, but in the lessons passed down through those who understood what it meant to carry something greater than oneself.